She sat on a park bench and tapped her fingers silently on the wood, hoping that someone would notice. Passers-by passed by, but one man stopped. She didn't realize that Chuck Norris himself was next to her. What happened next shocked the entire park. Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from. The evening sun cast long, golden fingers across the park, bathing everything in soft, fading light. Leaves rustled with a gentle breeze. Children squealed from the swings, and distant laughter echoed from a family picnic near the pond. It was the sort of peaceful scene that seemed untouched by danger, a portrait of suburban normalcy. But for the small girl sitting alone on the weathered wooden bench near the edge of the walking trail, it was anything but safe. 12-year-old Layla sat hunched forward, her arms tightly wrapped around a navy blue backpack that looked too big for her small frame. Her eyes, large and shadowed by long lashes, scanned the path ahead of her, darting back and forth with the restlessness of a cornered animal. She looked like any other child waiting for a late parent, perhaps a father finishing his run or a mother still parked at a grocery store. But Layla's gaze wasn't hopeful. It was watchful. Her body didn't rest, it braced. She knew he was still nearby, somewhere in the tree line, maybe behind the black van parked too perfectly beneath the tall sycamore tree, or perhaps pacing between the rows of benches where joggers sometimes stretched. He was there. She could feel it in the prickle on the back of her neck, and the way the hair on her arms stood despite the warm weather. They were watching her again, just like before. The park was busy enough to feel frustrating, not reassuring. Too many people meant too many distractions, too much noise, too many places to blend in. Layla wanted someone to see her, to really see her, but she had already tried speaking up. Once, at a gas station restroom when a woman with kind eyes had noticed the bruise on her arm. She whispered, "Help me," only for the woman to smile politely and say, "Are you lost, sweetie?" before returning to her car. After that, Jason and the others made sure she knew what would happen if she ever tried again. So now, silence was her shield and weapon. Tucked beneath the elastic wrist of her hoodie was a thin, rubber bracelet, barely noticeable, dark gray, worn with age. On the inside, invisible unless removed, were 3 raised dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots again. Her grandmother, a retired Air Force sergeant, had given it to her on her 11th birthday. If you can't scream, knock. If you can't knock, blink. But never stop trying, she had said. That bracelet, now tied around her wrist, was all she had left of her. Layla placed her fingers on the edge of the bench. 1, 2, 3, short taps. Then 1, 2, 3, long presses. Then 1, 2, 3, short again. SOS, over and over again, not too loud, not too obvious, just enough, just in case. Mothers passed by pushing strollers. A man with earbuds jogged past, sweat staining the sides of his tank top. A group of teens laughed as they kicked a soccer ball across the grass. No one noticed. Not the rhythm, not the stillness in her shoulders, not the fact that she hadn't moved from the bench in over an hour, until he sat down beside her. He didn't speak, just lowered himself slowly onto the far end of the bench with the ease and quiet of someone who'd done this kind of sitting many times before. He wore a plain beige jacket and dark jeans. His hair, silvery white, was cut short, and though age had carved lines around his eyes and mouth, there was something quietly powerful in the way he held himself. A plastic water bottle was cradled in one hand, his gaze resting lazily on the open path in front of them. He could have been anyone. Someone's grandfather, out for an evening walk, but when Layla tapped again, 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, he shifted, only slightly, a twitch in his jaw, a pause in his breathing, but enough for her to notice. Layla kept her face forward, her eyes blank. But inside, her heart slammed against her chest. Did he hear? The man didn't glance her way. Instead, he leaned back, took a sip from his bottle, and squinted towards the setting sun like a man trying to measure time without a watch. Then he looked across the trail. His eyes were sharp now, cutting through the shadows. He had noticed the van, and the man beside it. Jason. Layla felt a wave of nausea rise in her stomach at the sight of him. He leaned against the passenger door, arms crossed, hoodie pulled low. From a distance, he looked harmless, just another man waiting for someone. But she knew the truth, knew the gun that bulged behind his belt, the darkness behind his fake smiles. He hadn't always been a monster, not at first. When her mom dated him, he was funny, charming, attentive. But after the breakup, everything changed, especially after her mother refused to see him again. Then it became about Layla. He told her she reminded him of her mother, that she owed him her time, that if she didn't talk to him, someone else would. The first time he took her, he said it was just a drive. She didn't come home that night. The man on the bench breathed deeply, then turned his head, just enough to look at her. Layla froze. Their eyes met. He didn't blink, didn't smile, but he nodded. Once, subtly, as if to say, "I heard you." She almost broke then. Her lips quivered, her eyes burned, but she held it all inside, because she didn't know if Jason was watching, because she didn't know who this man was. But she hoped he was the one who would listen. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and began tapping one finger against his water bottle. Not fast, not rhythmic, not like hers, but it was a sign. He was communicating without words, not drawing attention. Layla mimicked him. Jason shifted by the van, started walking. Panic gripped her. She stopped tapping. The man saw. He stood, not abruptly, calmly, stretching his back like someone who had sat too long. He checked the bottle, frowned at its weight, and looked toward the path like he might go toss it in the bin. But his eyes flicked to Jason, calculating, watching. Then he walked off, slowly. Layla's fingers curled around the edge of the bench. She stared straight ahead. A moment passed. Then she heard it, his steps returning. He sat again, now slightly closer. In his hand was a small folded napkin, slightly crumpled. She saw the faint shape of something written on it. He didn't give it to her. Instead, he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. She didn't catch the words, but the tone was gentle, assuring. Her breathing steadied. And then he opened the napkin and held it out on his knee, angled just enough for her to read. On it, in tight, firm handwriting, were 3 words. "I believe you." She looked up. He looked back. Then he smiled, ever so slightly, and Layla, for the first time in days, felt something stronger than fear. Hope. Across the park, Jason narrowed his eyes. Something had shifted, and he didn't like it. The man on the bench was Chuck Norris, and he had just received the signal. The smile Chuck Norris gave her lingered in Layla's thoughts long after he stood and began walking toward the trash bin. It was a smile that didn't belong in the sterile world of television or behind the action hero mask she vaguely recognized from her childhood. It was a real smile, slow and understanding, the kind that made the air in her lungs settle for a few brief moments. But behind that stillness was something else, an alertness that matched her own. He had seen Jason. He knew something was wrong. Chuck took his time walking to the trash bin, letting his steps seem casual. He tossed the empty water bottle glanced at the van without turning his head, then slowly turned back to walk along the gravel path bordering the tree line. He didn't walk too far, just enough to make it look like he had no reason to linger near the bench, no cause to stay too close to the girl. But all the while, his peripheral vision tracked every movement around the parked van, the men leaning nearby and the girl still sitting like a statue on the bench. Jason had moved. Now he stood beside the van, one foot pressed casually against the tire, hands stuffed deep in the front pocket of his hoodie. He wasn't smiling anymore. His body was angled toward the bench, and his gaze, though hidden behind cheap sunglasses, was sharp and unblinking. He hadn't missed the subtle interaction. And if he hadn't figured out who Chuck Norris was by name, he'd sensed something else just as dangerous: interference. Layla tried to stay still, to pretend she hadn't noticed the shift, but her fingers trembled, her knees locked, her chest tightened with every second. She had given a signal. She had been heard. And now she had to trust that something, anything, would come of it. Chuck had encountered this kind of tension before, not on a film set, not behind a camera, but in real life, at benefit galas where women would pull him aside, their voices tight, asking for help to get away from a man who wouldn't take no. At children's hospitals where nurses whispered about parents who hadn't visited in months. And in the years after his public career began to fade from the spotlight, Chuck found himself drawn to places like this, quiet, ordinary corners of the world where danger wore the face of normalcy. He circled back along the path, pausing at a drinking fountain where he let the water trickle without drinking. A woman walked past with a toddler in tow. A teenage boy skated by on the trail. And as Chuck looked again toward the van, he took in the entire tableau with growing clarity. There were 3 of them. Jason was the most visible, the one designed to be seen. He played the concerned father, or maybe the estranged older brother, whatever story he decided to spin if anyone asked. His clothes were deliberately clean but casual. His expression could twist from harsh to gentle in seconds, depending on the audience. Then there was the man by the picnic table, wearing a faded maintenance shirt with a stitched name tag that read Paul. He sat on the bench like he had nowhere to be, sipping from a travel mug, but he wasn't relaxing. He was watching. Every few seconds he tapped something against his leg, a signal perhaps, or maybe just a nervous tick. Either way, Chuck filed it away. The third man was behind the van, barely visible, smoking, looking down at his phone. He didn't interact with the others. He didn't even glance at the girl. But that in itself said everything. He was the wheelman, the one who didn't break character. It was a well-organized triangle. And Layla was the prize at the center. Chuck's mouth set in a grim line. It wasn't the first time he had seen this configuration, but it might be the first time he'd seen it play out so brazenly. The park wasn't crowded enough for someone to blend into anonymity, but it wasn't empty enough for anyone to feel watched. A perfect stage. He walked back toward the bench, but didn't sit down this time. He glanced at Layla only briefly, then turned toward a small snack kiosk on the other end of the trail. A teenager stood behind the counter, scrolling on her phone. Chuck approached slowly, keeping his body relaxed, shoulders slightly slouched, the way people walked when they were simply killing time. When the girl finally noticed him, she jumped slightly. "Can I help you?" Chuck leaned in, lowered his voice. "Listen carefully," he said, his tone soft but firm. "That girl on the bench is in trouble. She's being watched. I need you to call 911, quietly. Tell them there are 3 men in a black van, possibly armed, possibly involved in child trafficking. Tell them to come without sirens. Tell them Chuck Norris said to hurry. The girl blinked, stared at him. Then her mouth fell open slightly. Wait, are you? Please, he interrupted, not unkindly. No pictures, just the call. She nodded, already fumbling with her phone, her fingers shaking. Chuck turned before she finished dialing. Back near the bench, Layla watched Jason begin to walk. He wasn't heading toward her, not directly. He made a show of walking along the trail, hands in his pockets, as if stretching his legs, but his path was clear. He would pass behind the bench, get a closer look, send a warning. Or worse. Layla couldn't move. She wanted to stand, to run, to scream, but her legs wouldn't obey. All she could do was hold on to the sides of the bench and wait. She thought about the bracelet on her wrist, about the staccato rhythm she'd tapped 100 times already, about her grandmother's voice, calm and steady. There's always a way out, even if it's just through someone else. Jason passed behind her, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. He didn't speak, didn't touch her, but she felt the weight of him, the heat of his presence, the threat in the silence. And then he kept walking. A breath escaped her lips, one she didn't know she'd been holding. Chuck returned and stood across the path, pretending to examine a nearby map of the park. His eyes scanned the area. The man at the picnic table had gotten up and now hovered near a trash bin. The driver had moved, cracking the van door open and leaning against it. Jason circled back, his path slower, more deliberate. Time was running out. Chuck reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded napkin. He scribbled something quickly, shielding it from view with his hand. Then, when Layla looked up at him, he gave the briefest flick of his fingers. "Come here." She hesitated, but then, slowly, she rose. She picked up her backpack, slung it over one shoulder, and shuffled toward the path like a child going to meet an uncle she barely remembered. She passed him, close enough to brush his sleeve. He slipped the napkin into her hand. She didn't stop, just kept walking, past the snack kiosk around the corner toward the restroom building. When she was out of sight, she opened the note. "Help is coming. Stay calm. Trust me." Layla's hands trembled as she folded it and tucked it deep into her pocket. She didn't cry. Not yet. But her breath shook. Back on the path, Chuck walked directly toward Jason. Their eyes met. Jason tensed. Chuck smiled, a smile so polite it was nearly empty. "Nice day," he said casually. Jason didn't answer. Chuck glanced at the van. "Is that yours?" Jason tilted his head. "Yeah, why?" "Just wondering," Chuck said. "Lot of vans in this park today." Jason's jaw shifted. "You following me?" Chuck chuckled. "Son, you've got it backward." They stood there, two men separated by a generation, by history, by experience, but each understanding exactly what the other was. Jason wasn't just angry. He was calculating. He didn't yet know who Chuck was, not truly, but he sensed something dangerous under the surface. "Your friend looks nervous," Chuck added, nodding toward the picnic table man. Jason didn't look. His lips pressed together. Chuck leaned in slightly. "You should leave." Jason smirked. "You should mind your business." Chuck's smile never changed. "Too late." From the corner of the park, sirens, not loud, but present, near enough to matter. Jason's smirk faltered. Chuck stepped back. "They're not here for me," he said, and walked away without waiting for an answer. At the snack kiosk, the girl lowered the phone. "They're coming," she whispered to herself. Layla stood near the restroom building, hidden behind a thick hedge. She saw the first black and white cruiser pull up silently near the park entrance. A second car followed. Officers stepped out, casual but alert. and in the middle of the park, Jason looked left, then right, calculating his exits. It wasn't over yet, but the shadows were beginning to shrink. Chuck turned one last time and looked toward the bench where it all began. Empty now, but not abandoned. Not anymore. Layla crouched behind the low hedge, her knees pressed into the dry dirt, her fingers digging into the straps of her backpack so tightly they throbbed. The restroom building loomed nearby, a square of cold gray concrete offering shade, but no comfort. Her eyes flicked towards the park entrance where the police cruisers had just arrived, the officers stepping out with that slow, deliberate gait that said they were trying not to startle anyone, but were ready for anything. A thin thread of hope coiled in her chest, fragile and new. They had come, just as the note said. Help is coming. Stay calm. Trust me. She could still feel the folded napkin in her pocket, though by now she'd memorized every word. It had been real. He wasn't just some old man passing by. He had seen her, listened, acted, and now, maybe, it was almost over. But hope was slippery. It had fooled her before. At the far end of the path, Chuck watched from beneath the shade of a large oak. His stance remained casual, hands loose at his sides, his gaze moving with practiced calm across the entire scene. His years in martial arts, in military training, and on the road doing charity work in hostile places had sharpened more than just his reflexes. He had an eye for tension, for the small cues that told you when a man was ready to bolt, or ready to strike. And Jason was no longer just watching. He was hunting. As soon as the first patrol car arrived, Jason had gone still. Not afraid, not hesitant, just calculating, like a predator assessing how far he could push before the trap closed. He had recognized the arrival of law enforcement not as a deterrent, but as a deadline. His window was closing. Chuck could see it in the shift of his shoulders, the flex of his jaw, the way his right hand disappeared into the pocket of his hoodie and didn't re-emerge. He wasn't bluffing. There was something in that pocket. And if Chuck was right, and his instincts rarely failed him, it was a gun. The officer nearest the parking lot was speaking into his radio, his voice calm, scanning the area. The other walked toward the center of the park, toward where Jason and his partners were still dispersed. The van remained parked beneath the tree, engine off, door slightly ajar. The driver hadn't moved, but his head was up now, eyes locked on the approaching officer. Chuck began moving again, slow, deliberate steps that took him along a curve in the walking path, bringing him closer to Layla's hiding spot. He didn't want to signal her, didn't want to risk drawing eyes her way, but he needed to get between her and the danger, and quickly. Jason turned and began walking toward the restroom building. The movement was unhurried but too direct, not a wander, not a stretch, not a stroll. It was intent, disguised as nonchalance. Chuck's pace quickened. Jason passed the picnic table, giving a brief nod to the man in the maintenance shirt. The man looked down, then stood, stretching. The driver of the van shifted again, tapping the door once with his hand. It was a signal. They were synchronizing. Chuck adjusted course and reached the side of the path just as Jason neared the hedge. From her crouched position, Layla saw him coming. Fear clamped around her chest like a vice. She ducked lower, praying he hadn't seen her. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The sense of safety she had allowed herself just moments before shattered. Then she heard another voice, lower, calm, steady. "Excuse me," Chuck said, stepping into Jason's path, placing himself directly between the man and the hedge. His body language was relaxed, almost dismissive, but his feet were planted, unmoving. Jason stopped barely a foot away. Chuck tilted his head slightly, forcing Jason to meet his eyes. "You lost?" Jason didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked over Chuck's shoulder toward the building. "Just going to the restroom," he muttered. Chuck smiled thinly. "Restrooms closed. Plumbing issue." Jason raised an eyebrow. "You work here now?" Chuck didn't blink. "I'm everywhere." Jason's hand twitched. "Oh man, you need to step aside." Chuck didn't move. Behind a hedge, Layla froze. She could hear everything, every word. Her hands trembled against the ground. Jason's jaw clenched. "I don't have time for this." "I think you do," Chuck said softly. "I think you got all the time in the world, unless you're in a rush to make a mistake." Their eyes locked. Chuck could see the moment Jason made his decision. It was small, just a tightening of the shoulders, a shift in his stance, a flicker of something dark behind the eyes. His hand moved. Not fast, not yet, but deliberate. Chuck's left hand came up, not to strike, not to block, but to signal. He raised it, shoulder height, palm facing the officers near the parking lot. A slow, practiced motion, the universal sign for hold. Jason's hand slid from his pocket. The pistol was small, black. No serial number. It fit easily in his palm, almost invisible against the dark fabric of his hoodie. But it was there. Chuck saw it, and acted. His right hand moved like lightning. Not a punch, not a kick. Just a controlled grasp, fingers closing around Jason's wrist and twisting downward in a move so fluid it looked rehearsed. The gun pointed toward the ground, then snapped from Jason's grip as Chuck twisted his arm behind his back and stepped forward, using Jason's own momentum to drive him off balance. Jason stumbled, then swung wildly with his free hand, but Chuck ducked beneath it, moving behind him in a blur and kicking his foot out from under him. Jason crashed to the ground, breath exploding from his lungs. The pistol slid across the dirt path and came to a stop beneath a bench. The other two men reacted. The driver lunged from the van, shouting something guttural. The man from the picnic table pulled something from his waistband, a small blade, glinting in the fading light. But now the officers were running. One of them shouted, "Police! Drop it!" The driver froze. The man with the knife dropped it instantly and raised his hands. Jason groaned on the ground, face twisted in pain, his right arm bent at an impossible angle beneath him. Chuck stood over him calm, composed, breathing steadily. "Don't move," he said. The officers swarmed the scene. One secured the weapon. Another knelt beside Jason and cuffed his wrists. The man in the maintenance shirt was already being frisked. The driver lay face down on the pavement, shouting about mistaken identity, about a misunderstanding. But no one listened. Chuck stepped back, allowing the officers to do their work. He turned toward the hedge. Layla stood there, wide-eyed, shaking, her face pale but her eyes dry. He walked to her slowly. "You're safe now," he said. She looked up at him, lips trembling. Then she rushed forward and wrapped her arms around his waist. He stiffened, just for a second. Then he rested a hand gently on her shoulder. One of the officers approached. "Sir, you okay?" Chuck nodded. "Just tired." The officer gestured toward Layla. "She the one?" "She's the reason you got here in time." The officer looked at the girl. "Miss, we're going to take you somewhere safe, all right? You did really well." Layla didn't answer. She just nodded and stepped back. The park was different now. The peaceful stillness had been replaced with flashing lights, radios chirping, the metallic clink of handcuffs, and the distant sobs of a mother who had arrived at the last moment. But inside that chaos, there was a pocket of stillness. Layla stood beside Chuck, watching the van being towed, the men being loaded into separate vehicles, the gun sealed into an evidence bag. "Is it really over?" she asked. He looked down at her. "For you," he said, "it's just beginning. But the worst part, that's done." She took a breath. For the first time in days, it didn't catch in her throat. Chuck walked with her to the patrol car. He didn't speak again, just waited until the door closed behind her and the engine started. As the car pulled away, she looked out the window, back toward the man who had sat beside her on a bench and heard her silent cry. He raised one hand, a wave, small but full of promise. Then he turned and walked into the gathering dusk, just another man in a park where monsters had been defeated. For now. The fluorescent lights in the police station buzzed faintly, a monotonous hum that underscored the surreal quiet that followed the chaos. Layla sat wrapped in a gray blanket that smelled faintly of starch and something vaguely floral, her knees drawn up to her chest on the cracked vinyl seat in the corner of the waiting room. The chair was cold beneath her, too firm to offer any comfort, and the silence pressed in around her like a second skin. There were voices in the distance, low, murmured conversations between officers, the static hiss of radios, but they seemed far away, like echoes from another world. A female officer sat across from her, notepad in hand, pen poised but not moving. She wasn't asking questions yet, just waiting, giving Layla the space to breathe. Her uniform was crisp, her hair tightly braided, and her gaze warm but unflinching. Her name tag read M. Rojas. She had introduced herself gently, not as a cop, but as someone who just wanted to listen. She hadn't asked Layla to talk, just told her she was safe now. Safe. The word had no real weight yet. It felt like something borrowed, an outfit she wasn't sure fit her anymore. She was here. Jason was not. That much she knew. She had seen him hauled away in handcuffs, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle, his face pale with shock and fury. She had watched him disappear into the back of a patrol car, watched the van get towed, the driver shoved against a hood, the third man cursing as he was pushed into custody. She had watched it all from the seat of another police cruiser, the windows rolled down just enough to feel the wind on her face. And now she was here. Her hands still trembled, her throat still ached, but she was here. Officer Rojas leaned forward slightly. "Whenever you're ready," she said softly. Layla took a breath, then another. Her voice, when it came, was fragile. "His name is Jason. Jason Kramer. He used to date my mom." Rojas nodded. "Go on." Layla told her everything. Not all at once, not in a straight line. Her words came in fits and starts, like a string unraveling in slow loops. About how Jason used to be nice, how he brought her flowers once, how he took her to the zoo and bought her cotton candy, how after her mom broke up with him, he started showing up at school, at the corner where her bus stopped, at the store where she and her mother bought groceries. How he always smiled, always said he just wanted to talk. How her mother tried to get a restraining order, but nothing came of it. How he took her. Her voice cracked when she reached that part. Rojas didn't interrupt, didn't take notes, just listened. Layla described the basement. Bare walls, a mattress on the floor, no windows. How he left food in plastic containers. How he told her it was all her fault, that if she had just answered his calls, he wouldn't have had to go so far. She talked about the others, 2 men whose names she never learned, who spoke little, always in code, always careful. She told Rojas about the bracelet, the tapping, the desperate hope that someone, anyone, might hear her. When she finally stopped, her voice was hoarse, her eyes dry. There were no more tears left. Rojas reached across the table and placed a paper cup of water in front of her. "You're very brave," she said. Layla didn't feel brave. She felt empty. In another room down the hall, Chuck Norris sat across from a detective with graying temples and a well-worn notepad. The man had recognized him immediately, but to his credit had treated him no differently than any other civilian. Chuck appreciated that. He didn't want special treatment. He wanted accuracy, clarity, facts. "I didn't see the weapon until he pulled it," Chuck said, "but the fear in that girl's eyes told me all I needed to know." The detective nodded. "You've got good instincts." "I've had a lot of practice," Chuck replied. The detective scratched something into his pad. "You ever been in a situation like this before?" "Not exactly, but close enough." Chuck leaned back slightly. "She tried to reach out, not with words, but with signs. She tapped an SOS. She passed me a note. I did what anyone should have done." "Not everyone would have recognized it," the detective said. "They should," Chuck said simply. The detective looked up. "She's safe now, thanks to you." Chuck didn't answer right away. "She saved herself. I just listened." When the interview concluded, Chuck was free to go. The officers offered to call him a car, offered him coffee, offered to escort him to a back exit to avoid the press already beginning to gather outside. He declined all of it. Walked out the front door, straight and silent, into the cooling night air. Inside the station, Officer Rojas led Layla to a quieter room with a couch and a small table. There were blankets folded on a shelf and a box of tissues on the corner of the desk. A social worker was on her way. Her mother had been contacted. She was driving in from 2 towns over, nearly broke the speed limit in tears when they told her Layla was alive and unharmed. Layla sat down slowly, clutching the new blanket Rojas gave her. Her legs dangled from the edge of the couch. She looked small again. Childlike, but her eyes had aged in ways no one her age should have known. "Can I ask you something?" she said suddenly. Rojas looked up. "Of course. That man, the one who helped me, do you know who he is?" Rojas smiled faintly. "His name's Chuck Norris." Layla blinked. "Like the movies?" "Yeah, but he's more than that." Rojas paused. "He's someone who doesn't walk away." Layla absorbed that, nodded slowly. "Do you want to rest a little?" Rojas asked. Layla didn't answer. Instead, she leaned back on the couch, pulling the blanket tighter. Her eyes drifted toward the window, where the world outside looked the same as it always had. Trees, streetlights, passing cars. But now, she knew, just beneath that surface, there were monsters. And heroes. In the holding cell at the far end of the station, Jason sat in silence, his cuffed hands resting on his knees. The smugness was gone, replaced with something harder, darker. He had been caught. But it was temporary. His mind churned, not with regret, but with calculation. Charges would be filed. Illegal possession of a firearm, attempted abduction, violation of a protective order. There might even be federal charges if the van and its contents connected to other missing girls. And they would. Officers had already discovered a notebook in the van's glove compartment. Names, addresses, photos, schedules, duct tape, zip ties, a burner phone with coded messages. It was enough for a dozen indictments. Jason said nothing. He knew how to be quiet. Back in the softer corners of the station, Layla's mother arrived. The reunion was not dramatic. There were no screams, no collapsing into arms. Just silence. And tears. The kind that spoke of guilt and love and overwhelming relief. Layla stood still in her mother's embrace, her arms at first unmoving, then slowly, uncertainly, wrapping around her mother's waist. Neither of them spoke. There were no words for what had almost happened, only what hadn't. The social worker arrived shortly after. She was warm, calm, the kind of person who knew how to talk in circles until the hard parts softened. She spoke with Layla and her mother together, about counseling, about temporary housing, about protection and recovery, about the long road ahead. Layla listened. She nodded at all the right moments. She didn't cry again. By the time the sun began to rise, the sky streaked with soft pinks and golds, Layla and her mother were preparing to leave. The station had given them a private escort home. Layla had been offered food, clothing, support, and one more thing. Officer Rojas walked up as they stood at the front desk. She handed Layla a small paper bag. Inside was a keychain, round, smooth, with a built-in personal alarm, a canister of pepper spray, and a note, handwritten in tight, neat script. Tools I hope you'll never need, but if you do, you'll know what to do. Stay safe. Chuck. Layla smiled for the first time in what felt like years. It was small, but real. That evening, as the world returned to its rhythm, news of the incident began to spread. Local news stations led with it. Child saved in park. Attempted abduction thwarted. Retired celebrity intervenes. But most reports didn't linger on Chuck Norris's name for long. The focus shifted quickly to Layla, her bravery, her silence, her signal. Articles titled "The Girl Who Knocked" and "SOS from the Bench" flooded social media. Schools began talking about teaching Morse code. Parents shared videos about signs of trafficking. And, in the middle of it all, Layla's name remained quiet, protected, not because she wanted to be hidden, but because now finally she had a choice. She had found her voice, and soon she would use it. But not today. Today she would rest. Today she would breathe without fear, because the monsters were behind bars, and she had lived to see the dawn. The park looked the same as it had that evening. The trees stood in their familiar places, tall and unbothered, their branches whispering in the breeze. The paths still wound lazily between benches and fountains, and birds still called overhead as if nothing in the world had changed. But for Layla, everything was different. She stood at the edge of the gravel trail, her sneakers quiet on the path, and stared at the old wooden bench where, weeks ago, she had sat in silence and waited for someone to hear her. She hadn't planned to come back, not so soon. Her therapist had gently suggested it, saying that sometimes returning to the place where fear had taken root could help strip it of its power. Her mother had been more hesitant, protective as ever, but Layla had insisted. She didn't want to avoid the place for the rest of her life. She wanted to rewrite what it meant to her. They had come early, before the park filled with weekend crowds. Her mother waited nearby, sitting on a bench beneath a wide birch tree, giving her space but never letting her out of sight. Layla appreciated that. It was a quiet understanding between them now. No more pretending everything was fine, but no more hiding either. Layla approached the bench slowly, her steps careful. The same lines of old wood greeted her, the same chipped paint, the same creak when she pressed down to sit. She lowered herself onto it and stared ahead, just as she had that day. Her backpack was lighter this time, filled not with panic or despair, but a journal, a bottle of water, and the small paper bag that Officer Rojas had given her. She reached into it now and pulled out the keychain, a simple, round object with a small button in the center, a safety alarm. Next to it was a note, slightly crinkled but still intact. "Tools I hope you'll never need, but if you do, you'll know what to do. Stay safe. Chuck." She'd read it a dozen times since, memorized the neat, unwavering handwriting. Every time she looked at it, it made her feel a little more grounded, a little more certain that she hadn't imagined it all. A week after the incident, a letter had arrived in the mail. No return address, just her name, written carefully in block letters. Inside was another bracelet, this one new, its interior marked with a different pattern, more Morse code. She had used the key tucked inside to decipher it, sitting cross-legged on the floor of her room, notebook in hand, her mind alert and focused. When she finished, she had smiled. "You are not alone." The words had stunned her more than any news article, more than any interview request or supportive message. It wasn't about Chuck Norris being a legend or the news calling her a hero. It was about being seen, being known, not being invisible anymore. Now she wore the bracelet every day. She sat on the bench for nearly half an hour, watching the world move. A jogger passed, nodding politely. A woman walked her dog, smiling with quiet curiosity. A boy chased a pigeon across the grass. Nothing extraordinary, nothing sinister, just life continuing. Then she noticed the girl. She was sitting on the far side of the park, on another bench near the sandbox. Small, maybe 8 or 9, her hair pulled into neat braids, her shoes mismatched. She sat very still, not playing, not watching the other children. Her gaze was fixed on the walking path, her hands clenched around the edge of the seat, and beside her, standing just a little too close, was a man. Layla's body went still. She watched, carefully. The man was middle-aged, clean-shaven, wearing jeans and a t-shirt. Nothing unusual, but his posture was wrong. Too stiff, too close. He didn't look at the girl as if he were related to her. He looked at her like she was inventory. He was talking into his phone, not loudly, but with short, clipped words. And the girl, she wasn't looking at him. She wasn't responding at all. Her eyes were locked on the path, on the people passing, on Layla. Then, slowly, the girl raised one hand to the edge of the bench and tapped her fingers. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Layla's heart froze. It wasn't a mistake. The rhythm was unmistakable. She stood. Her hands were shaking, but she didn't hesitate. She slung her backpack over one shoulder and walked across the grass. Not too fast, not too slow, her eyes on the girl the entire time. Her mother stood up from her bench in alarm, calling her name, but Layla raised a hand and kept walking. When she reached the bench, she didn't look at the man. She looked at the girl and smiled. "Hi," she said softly, her voice steady despite the thunder in her chest. "Can I sit with you?" The girl didn't answer, but her eyes widened slightly. She nodded. Layla sat, her shoulders relaxed. She turned slightly, enough to face the man now. "Is this your daughter?" she asked. The man blinked. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, we're just waiting for her mom." Layla didn't respond. She just stared at him, silent. There was something unnerving about her gaze, something that made the man hesitate, shift his weight, and glance away. "I'm going to call someone," Layla said quietly. "And if you move before they get here, I'll scream loud enough for the whole park to hear." The man's eyes narrowed. "Look, I don't know what you think is—" Layla didn't blink. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Then the alarm keychain. She held it in her hand, thumb resting on the button. The man stepped back. "Fine," he muttered. "Whatever. I was just trying to help." He walked away. Not fast, but he didn't look back. Layla watched him go. Her heart pounded. Her palms were slick, but she didn't falter. She turned to the girl beside her. "Are you okay?" The girl nodded barely. Her voice was barely audible. "He said he knew my mom." Layla reached into her bag again and pulled out the pepper spray. She placed it gently into the girl's lap. "This is yours now," she said. "Don't be afraid to use it." The girl stared at it. "Why are you helping me?" Layla smiled. "Because someone helped me." Footsteps approached. It was her mother, breathless, fear in her eyes. Layla stood to meet her, squeezing the girl's hand once before letting go. "We need to tell someone," she said, already pulling out her phone again. The authorities were called. Park security arrived first, then 2 patrol officers. The man had vanished, but security footage from the cameras near the park entrance was reviewed. Within hours, a city-wide alert was issued. The girl's mother was found, frantic and terrified. She had been distracted by a phone call, separated from her daughter for only minutes, but it had been enough. When the dust settled, Layla sat once more on her original bench, the sun dipping low behind the trees. Her mother sat beside her now, silent, shaken, proud. "You did the right thing," she said. "I just listened," Layla replied, like he did. She reached into her pocket and ran her fingers over the edge of the note Chuck had written. The ink was fading. The paper was soft and worn, but the words were still there. "You are not alone." Later that week, a new story appeared in the paper, a follow-up piece. No longer about a girl saved by a stranger, but about a girl who became a signal herself, who saw what others didn't, who refused to walk away. Layla didn't read the story more than once. She didn't need to. She already knew how it ended. It ended with her listening, and with someone else finally being heard. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe for more. Watch our next videos for more stories that matter. And don't forget to share this video. You never know who might need it.